You know how it goes. A crisis erupts in one country. Could be anything. A war, a strike, a financial meltdown. But in our world today, that crisis almost never stays put. All of a sudden, freight rates are skyrocketing in a totally different region. Your lead times are blowing out on another continent, and customer deliveries are failing thousands of miles away from where it all started. And this brings up a really critical question for any modern business.
So let's just make this personal for a second. An event happens on the complete other side of the planet. It feels distant, totally unrelated to you, so why should you care? How can something so far away directly mess with your operations, your costs, and ultimately your customers? Well, that's the big puzzle we're going to unpack right now.
For a long time, the thinking was pretty simple. Physical distance meant you were safe. If you weren't actually in the crisis zone, you were probably fine. But that is a dangerous, outdated myth. The new reality is that our supply chains are networks. And in a network, distance doesn't matter nearly as much as connection. Your real risk is all about who and what you're connected to.
And that gets us to the most fundamental rule for understanding risk today. We have to completely shift our thinking away from geography and start focusing on connectivity. So let's dive into what that really means.
Okay, if there's one thing you remember from this, let it be this quote. A crisis doesn't just spread out like ripples in a pond. No, it travels along the very specific highways of global trade. Your suppliers, the shipping lanes, the financial systems. Your real vulnerability isn't where you are on a map. It's your specific position within that global network.
What's so interesting here is how this forces us to completely rethink risk. We tend to fixate on things like, how many kilometers away is the problem? Or is my local warehouse running smoothly? But what actually matters are these deeper links. Are your critical suppliers in that region? Do your products have to travel through that specific airspace or sea lane? Do you rely on shipping capacity that is now being sucked into the crisis zone? Those are the questions that define your real exposure.
Okay, so if a crisis travels through these connections, what are they? What do these so-called transmission channels actually look like? How does a shock physically and systematically travel from one point of failure to the entire global network?
Well, we can basically group them into three big buckets. First, you've got the obvious ones, the physical links, the actual movement of stuff. Then you have the system links. These are kind of the invisible rules and markets that control everything. And finally, and this one's fascinating, you have the behavioral links, which is all about how we, as people and companies, react to the chaos.
Let's kick off with the most straightforward one, physical links. I mean, if your supplier's factory is in the middle of the crisis zone, that's a direct hit. Obvious. But it's also about the journey. A blocked sea lane, a closed bit of airspace, or a super congested border can bring your goods to a screeching halt, even if their origin and their destination are both perfectly stable.
Next up are the system links, and this is where it gets a little more subtle. When a crisis hits, things like shipping containers, planes, and ships, which are all finite resources, right? They get moved around. This creates scarcity. And what happens when things get scarce? Prices go up, everywhere. On top of that, governments might slap on sanctions, create new customs hurdles, or cause banking delays that can slow or even stop the flow of goods and money. The crisis is literally spreading through paperwork.
And finally, we get to the behavioral links. When companies get a whiff of instability, what's the first thing they do? They panic buy. They order extra inventory, create buffer stock just in case. But this reaction, happening all at once across the entire network, actually creates a second wave of disruption. Suddenly, there are shortages in one place because someone else over-ordered. The network starts reacting to its own fear, which just makes the original problem way worse.
Now, these channels don't exist in a vacuum. The global supply chain has these features, these characteristics built right into it that can take a pretty small local problem and just amplify it into a massive global shockwave.
The biggest amplifier of them all is the choke point. I'm talking about places like the Suez Canal, the Port of Shanghai, or a huge air cargo hub. These are spots where a massive chunk of global trade is squeezed through a tiny passage. A problem at one of these choke points doesn't just affect the stuff passing through at that moment. It creates a global traffic jam, causing delays and shortages across the entire system.
This is so important to get. The global market for ships, planes, and trucks is really just one giant interconnected pool of capacity. So if a crisis in one region suddenly needs more ships or planes, that capacity gets pulled from other routes. So even if your trade lane is thousands of miles away with clear skies and calm seas, you will feel the pain. You'll feel it through higher prices and less available space because the market itself is spreading the disruption.
And this chart just illustrates that point perfectly. Look at this.
This route has absolutely no physical connection to the crisis, but because the shipping carriers are repricing their risk and moving their assets around the globe, the cost on your supposedly safe route can almost double. That is the transport market in action, acting as a giant amplifier and spreading the pain far and wide.
So, with all this in mind, how do we actually change our approach? The goal has to be to stop thinking about the direct, obvious threats and start learning to see these indirect, network-based risks before they hit us.
You know, it's a really common mistake to think, hey, our local warehouse is running, we're okay. But that warehouse depends on a nice, steady, predictable flow of goods coming in. The moment that upstream flow becomes erratic and unstable, your local operation goes from smooth, structured work to just constant, chaotic firefighting, dealing with exceptions, changing plans, and explaining delays over and over again.
And this really highlights the two different ways to play the game. On one side, you have the reactive company. They're looking at a map, they're waiting for a shipment to actually fail before they do anything, but by then, it's too late. Your options are gone and the costs are through the roof. On the other side, you have the proactive company. They've mapped their network connections. They're watching for the early indirect signs like freight rates ticking up on other routes, and they act before the whole system has a chance to react and reprice all the risk.
And that right there is the ultimate takeaway for building a resilient business. It's not really about predicting the next crisis, it's about understanding your network so deeply that you can see the secondary effects coming down the pipe, and then make adjustments to your inventory, your transport plans, your sourcing, while you still have time and you still have options.
So I'll just leave you with this one question to really think about. Stop asking how far away you are from the next crisis. Instead, start asking how many of your suppliers, your transit routes, and your logistics partners are connected to it. Because in the end, that connection is what will truly determine how close that crisis really is.